At the shelter, the boy heard that no one would adopt someone like him. Months later, a man showed up with papers proving them all wrong, but that wasn't all. Ethan lived in a small orphanage in St. Louis, Missouri. He was 11 years old and had arrived at this place after losing his parents in a car accident 2 years ago. The building had faded paint and creaking floors. The bedrooms were crowded, with several children sharing the same space. The meals were simple, often thin soup and bread, and the staff, though not unkind, were always busy and tired. Ethan tried not to draw attention. He kept to himself and helped whenever asked. Early each morning, he woke up before most of the other children. He folded laundry or cleaned the dining area. He tried to stay useful, hoping it might make him more noticeable in a positive way. Still, he overheard whispers that no one would ever adopt a boy like him. He was old enough to understand that his chances were small. He also knew being a black boy in the system made everything harder. Some children repeated hurtful remarks. "Nobody wants someone like you." He felt the sting, but he refused to let it show. After his chores, Ethan walked to school. The route took him through quiet streets with small shops, old houses, and empty lots. School was not difficult for him, but he kept a low profile, never raising his hand and never causing trouble. At lunchtime, he sat alone in the cafeteria. He carried a small notebook where he drew when he felt lonely or worried. He never showed these drawings to anyone. They were his private way of expressing thoughts he could not put into words. His parents had died suddenly. He remembered only flashes of that day, the sound of tires, bright headlights, and a waiting room in a hospital. No relatives were able to take him in. Now he lived here, following the same routine every day. Still, he managed to hold on to a quiet hope that something good might happen, even if he did not know what. After school, he returned to the orphanage. He helped clean up after dinner, wiping down tables and sweeping the floor. The soup smelled bland, but he had grown used to it. Once he finished his tasks, he had a bit of free time. Sometimes he just stared out the window, but on this particular gray afternoon, Ethan decided to go for a short walk to a nearby park. It was only a few blocks away, and the staff allowed him that small freedom as long as he returned before dark. The park was small, with a few benches, some trees, and a narrow path. Nothing special, but it was quieter than the orphanage. Ethan brought his notebook along. He wanted to draw something other than the same old walls. The sky was overcast, and there were few people around. He noticed an older man sitting on a bench. The man had white hair and wore a worn scarf. His shoulders were slumped, and it looked like he might be crying. Ethan slowed down, unsure what to do. Approaching a stranger felt risky, but something about the man's posture made Ethan concerned. The man seemed lost in thought, wiping his eyes now and then. Ethan stood a short distance away, pretending to look elsewhere. He glanced over and saw that the man looked lonely. Ethan knew what loneliness felt like. He understood what it meant to have no one who truly cared. He wondered if the man had lost someone, just like Ethan had. He considered leaving, but he did not want to abandon this man to his sadness. Still, Ethan hesitated. He knew little about how adults might react if he bothered them. He was just a kid from the orphanage. Maybe the man would be annoyed. But Ethan thought about how nobody had offered him comfort when he first arrived at the orphanage, how he had to deal with his sadness alone. Maybe he could do something small for this man, even if it was just sitting nearby. He took a few slow steps closer. The bench was ahead, and he could see that the man's eyes were red. There were no other people nearby. The silence felt heavy. Ethan tried to think of something to say. He almost left, but then he took a breath and decided he would at least try to offer a kind word. He approached the bench carefully, holding his notebook tightly. The man looked up, noticing Ethan. Their eyes met. Ethan felt his heart beat faster. He planned to ask if it was okay to sit. He opened his mouth, but the words did not come out immediately. Instead, he managed a small, gentle nod, as if seeking permission. The man did not say anything yet, but he did not tell Ethan to leave either. Ethan stood there for a moment, gathering his courage. The man seemed fragile, and Ethan did not want to make things worse. He thought about the times he wished someone had asked him if he needed a friend. He would have appreciated it. Maybe the man would appreciate it too. Ethan decided he would speak softly and simply. He would not ask too many questions. He would just let the man know he was not alone. He opened his mouth again, ready to say hello. Ethan cleared his throat gently. "Hi," he said in a calm, low voice. "Are you okay? Do you want some company?" He kept his distance, standing near the bench but not too close. He waited for the man's response. The older man looked surprised, as if he did not expect anyone to speak to him. "Company?" the man repeated. His voice sounded tired and a bit shaky. "You can sit if you want." Ethan nodded and sat down at the opposite end of the bench, leaving space so the man would not feel crowded. They sat quietly at first. Ethan glanced at the man. He had wrinkles around his eyes and he looked exhausted. He was probably in his 70s, though Ethan was not sure. "I'm Ethan," the boy said after a moment. "I'm Thomas," the man said, his voice soft. They faced forward, looking at the worn path and a few pigeons searching for food near a trash can. Ethan felt nervous but determined to be kind. He tried to think of something gentle to say. "I saw you from over there," Ethan said quietly. "You looked sad. I know what it's like to feel alone." Thomas nodded slowly. He reached up and wiped his face again, trying to steady himself. "I lost my wife a few months ago," he said. "I do not have children, and I live by myself now. It feels empty." Ethan listened. He understood the weight of loss. "I live in an orphanage," he said. "I lost my parents, so I understand feeling alone." He did not go into detail. He just wanted Thomas to know he understood something about that kind of pain. Thomas looked at Ethan for a moment. He seemed surprised that this boy, a complete stranger, would relate to his loss. "I'm sorry about your parents," Thomas said. His voice was quiet. "It must be very hard." Ethan shrugged slightly. "It's not easy," he said. "I go to school, I help at the orphanage, and I draw in this notebook." He lifted the notebook slightly, but he did not open it. He was not ready to show his drawings yet. Thomas seemed interested. "You like to draw?" he asked. "Yes," Ethan said. "It helps me feel better. I draw what I see or what I wish I could see." Thomas nodded. "I used to travel with my wife," he said. "We saw many places. Now I don't feel like going anywhere by myself." They fell into a comfortable silence. Ethan did not feel the need to fill every moment with words. Just sitting there quietly felt nice. He hoped Thomas felt a little less alone now. After a few minutes, Ethan realized it was getting late, and he needed to return to the orphanage before the staff worried. "I should go," Ethan said, standing up. Thomas looked at him. "Thank you for stopping," he said softly. "It helped." Ethan gave a small nod. "Maybe I'll come by tomorrow," he said. Thomas nodded, but did not say much more. Ethan walked away, feeling that something meaningful had happened. Back at the orphanage, the other children were heading to dinner. The meal was soup again, and a staff member ladled it into bowls. Ethan took a seat at a table by himself. A boy nearby commented, "Nobody is ever going to adopt you." Ethan ignored the remark. He remembered Thomas's sad eyes and realized that there was more than one kind of loneliness. He ate quietly, thinking about the bench in the park. After dinner, he went to the small room he shared with two other boys. He sat on the bed and opened his notebook. He drew a rough sketch of the park bench, showing two figures, an older man and a boy sitting at opposite ends. He tried to make the lines clear and simple. This drawing was a memory now. He felt calmer after making it. That night, Ethan lay in bed thinking about Thomas. He imagined what it must feel like to lose someone after so many years together. He thought about his parents, but his memories of them were fading. He remembered their faces only from a few photographs he once had. He closed his eyes and listened to the quiet breathing of the other boys. Nobody asked about his afternoon, and he preferred it that way. The next day followed the usual pattern. Ethan got up early, helped fold some laundry, and prepared for school. The school day was uneventful. He listened to lessons, ate lunch alone, and then headed back toward the orphanage. On the way, he decided he would stop at the park again. He did not know if Thomas would be there, but he hoped he would. If not, he would just draw something else. When Ethan reached the park, the sky was still gray. He looked at the bench and saw Thomas sitting in the same spot. The man looked up when Ethan approached. "You're back," Thomas said softly. Ethan nodded. "I said I might come by," he replied. He sat down again, leaving space, just as before. They spoke quietly about ordinary things. Ethan mentioned his school day, nothing specific, just that he had math class and science class. Thomas said he had not felt like cooking, so he had some bread and tea for lunch. They did not discuss their losses this time. Instead, they just shared a calm presence, as if giving each other silent support. Ethan opened his notebook and showed Thomas the drawing he had made of them. Thomas looked at it carefully. "You are good at capturing what you see," he said. "It looks just like yesterday." Ethan felt pleased that Thomas appreciated it. He was not used to compliments. Time passed quietly. Eventually, Ethan had to leave again. Thomas thanked him for coming by. "You helped me feel less alone," Thomas said. Ethan replied, "You helped me too," and he meant it. He returned to the orphanage with a slight sense of comfort that he had not felt in a long time. When he entered, no one noticed he had been gone. He sat down in a corner of the common room. He thought about how different the park felt compared to this place. The orphanage was always crowded, yet he felt alone here. At the park, he found one person who understood sadness. That understanding felt good. He looked down at his notebook and considered what else he might draw next time. Perhaps something about Thomas's stories, if Thomas ever shared more. Ethan felt that they might have more to say to each other in the days ahead. The next afternoon, Ethan walked to the park once again. It had become a small routine. After school, he passed by the orphanage to drop off his backpack and then asked if he could take a short walk. He knew the staff might get curious if he did this too often, but for now, nobody questioned him. He headed out, hoping to find Thomas there. The air felt heavier and the sky looked the same dull gray as before. When Ethan reached the familiar bench, Thomas was there, wearing the same worn scarf. He looked up and gave a small nod. Ethan sat down quietly. They had grown comfortable enough that words were not always needed at the start. Ethan took out his notebook and flipped through a few pages. He paused at a drawing he had made last night, just simple outlines of the trees and the bench. Thomas leaned over slightly to see. "You draw every day?" he asked. Ethan nodded. "I try to," he said. "It helps me relax." Thomas looked thoughtful. He seemed to be considering what to say. After a short pause, he spoke. "I keep thinking about my wife," he said quietly. "We were married for a very long time. I do not have children, and she was my family. After she died, I lost my sense of direction. I come to this park because we used to walk here." Ethan listened closely. He understood that Thomas needed to talk about these things. "I'm sorry," Ethan said. "I don't remember my parents very well. I was 9 when they died, and some details have faded. But I know what it's like to not have anyone close. It feels empty." He looked down at his notebook, pressing his pencil lightly against the page. Thomas sighed. "She was a kind person," he said. "We lived in a small house not far from here. We never had children, but we were happy. Now I find it hard to be in the house alone, so sometimes I come here and think about the life we had. I know it will never come back, but sitting here makes it feel a little less empty." Ethan's voice was soft as he replied, "Sometimes I close my eyes and remember sitting in the car with my parents, or I think about how my mom smiled, how my dad laughed. But it is hard. At the orphanage, I am just one of many kids. People come in looking to adopt younger children, maybe babies, but not usually someone like me. They tell me not to hope too much." Thomas looked at Ethan with sympathy. "That sounds unfair," he said. "You seem like a good boy. I'm sorry people say those things. It must feel discouraging." Ethan shrugged slightly. "I try not to let it bother me, but it does sometimes," he admitted. They sat together in silence for a few minutes. Occasionally, an older couple passed by, or a person walking a dog. No one really paid attention to them. Ethan found that peaceful. He liked that he could be himself here without anyone bothering him. After a while, Thomas asked, "What kind of things do you like to draw besides the park?" Ethan thought about it. "I draw all kinds of things," he said. "Sometimes I draw what I see, like this bench. Other times I draw things I wish I had, like a bedroom with my own desk, or a house with a backyard. I also draw places I want to visit, like the ocean. I have never seen the ocean." Thomas nodded. "My wife and I visited the ocean once," he said. "It was beautiful, with big waves and salty air. Maybe someday you will see it too." Ethan smiled slightly. "Maybe," he said, trying to keep his voice steady. He hoped that someday he would have a family that could take him to places he had never been. They continued talking until Ethan noticed the afternoon light starting to fade. He stood up, not wanting to be scolded for returning late. "I need to go," he said. Thomas nodded and thanked him for coming by again. "You help me remember that I am not the only one who is alone," Thomas said quietly. "It gives me some comfort." Ethan understood those words. He felt the same. "I'll come tomorrow if I can," he said. Thomas nodded, and Ethan left, feeling a mix of sadness and warmth. Back at the orphanage, he washed his hands before dinner. As usual, the meal was simple. After eating, he sat in a corner and looked at his notebook. He remembered Thomas's words about the ocean and thought about drawing it. He tried to picture it from what he had seen on TV or in magazines. He drew gentle waves and a small figure standing at the shore, looking out at the horizon. It was just a sketch, but it felt good to create something new. One of the staff members passed by and looked at his drawing. She said nothing and continued on. Ethan was used to that. Afterward, he went to bed, thinking about what Thomas had shared. He felt glad that Thomas trusted him enough to talk about his wife. It made Ethan feel that their connection was growing. The next day after school, he headed to the park again. The routine felt normal now, as if he had a friend waiting for him. He was not sure if he could call Thomas a friend, but that was how he felt. When Ethan arrived at the bench, Thomas was already there. This time, Thomas had brought a small thermos of tea. He nodded at Ethan as the boy sat down. "Would you like some tea?" Thomas asked. Ethan hesitated. He rarely accepted things from strangers, but Thomas did not feel like a stranger anymore. He nodded, and Thomas poured a bit of warm tea into a small cup. Ethan sipped it carefully. It was a mild flavor, not sweet, but comforting. "Thank you," Ethan said. Thomas smiled slightly. "I thought maybe we could share something warm," he said. They sat in silence for a few minutes, sipping tea. Then Thomas said, "I've been thinking a lot about you, Ethan. I'm surprised that at your age, you carry yourself with so much understanding. You seem older than 11 in some ways." Ethan shrugged. "Living in an orphanage changes you," he said. "You learn to be independent. You learn not to expect too much. It doesn't mean I don't hope. I just don't tell people about it." He tapped his notebook lightly, a habit he developed when he felt unsure of what else to say. Thomas nodded. "I understand," he said. I have also been trying to figure out what to do with my life now. My home feels empty, and I do not have many friends. People are kind to me, but they have their own lives. They do not understand what it's like to lose someone after so long. They say nice words, but they go back to their routines, and I am left alone. Ethan listened carefully. At the orphanage, there are a lot of children, but sometimes I feel alone there too, he said. Nobody really knows me. They don't know what I dream about. They just see another kid who lost his parents. I think you and I both know what it feels like to be invisible. Thomas looked sad at that thought. Yes, maybe we both feel invisible, he said. But at least we see each other. That's something. Ethan considered that. It felt true. Talking to Thomas was different from talking to anyone else. They understood each other's pain without needing to explain every detail. I like coming here, Ethan said softly. It makes me feel normal. At the orphanage, people sometimes say hurtful things. They say no one will adopt me. It makes me feel like I don't belong anywhere. But here with you, I just feel like a person talking to another person. Thomas seemed moved by Ethan's words. He patted the bench next to him, as if to say, "We belong here together." He did not say it out loud, but Ethan understood. The quiet gesture was clear. After they finished their tea, Ethan asked Thomas more about his past. "What was your wife's name?" Ethan asked. Thomas's eyes softened. "Her name was Margaret," he said. "She had a gentle laugh. She loved to bake bread and cookies. She was patient and kind. She would have liked you, I think." Ethan smiled. "I wish I could have met her," he said. Thomas nodded, holding back tears. "I wish that too," he said. They changed the subject after a few moments. Ethan told Thomas about his favorite teacher in school, who let him borrow books from the classroom shelf. He mentioned that he enjoyed reading stories, especially ones that showed people overcoming difficult times. Thomas listened with interest and asked him which stories he liked best. Ethan described a book about a boy who rescued a stray dog, and Thomas smiled. A cool breeze passed through the park. Ethan noticed that Thomas looked tired. His eyes were red and he seemed thinner than before. "Are you feeling okay?" Ethan asked gently. Thomas tried to smile. "I'm fine, just a bit tired," he said. Ethan wondered if there was more to it, but he did not push the subject. He did not want to make Thomas uncomfortable. The afternoon light began to fade again. Ethan knew he had to leave soon, but he wanted to tell Thomas something first. "Thank you for listening to me and for sharing your story," Ethan said. "I know we don't know each other very well, but I feel like I can talk to you. It means a lot." Thomas nodded. "It means a lot to me, too," he said. "I appreciate your visits. I feel less alone knowing I'll see you here." They said goodbye, and Ethan walked back to the orphanage. Inside, he overheard some staff members talking. They mentioned that older children are often overlooked by adoptive parents. Ethan knew that. He tried not to let it bother him. He went to the bedroom, took out his notebook, and started a new drawing. This time he drew the thermos and 2 cups of tea. He tried to capture that simple, quiet moment of warmth and understanding. As he drew, he thought about Thomas's tired eyes and the way he tried to hide his sorrow. He also thought about how, despite everything, Thomas was willing to open up and share something personal with him. It made Ethan feel valued, and that feeling mattered a lot to a boy who spent most of his days trying not to be forgotten. He finished the drawing and flipped through the pages of his notebook. Each page felt like a record of their growing connection. He had never expected to find comfort in talking to an older man in a park, but now he could not imagine his afternoons without those visits. Ethan went to sleep that night feeling a bit more hopeful. He knew nothing had changed in terms of the orphanage rules or adoption policies. He was still just another child waiting for something that might never come. But now, he had someone who understood his feelings, and that made his world less empty. The next week passed much like the previous ones. Ethan visited Thomas at the park most afternoons. They continued talking about their lives, sharing quiet moments and listening to each other. The weather grew colder, and the leaves on the trees became sparse. Sometimes the wind felt sharp against Ethan's face, but he did not mind. He was glad to have someone waiting for him at that bench. Inside the orphanage, the staff began to notice Ethan's frequent outings. One afternoon, as Ethan asked for permission to visit the park, the head supervisor looked at him with suspicion. "You have been leaving a lot lately," she said. "Where are you going?" Ethan hesitated. He knew if he mentioned meeting an older man, they might misunderstand. He decided to keep his answer simple. "I go to the park to draw," he said. She narrowed her eyes. "Be careful, Ethan," she said, "and do not stay out late." Ethan nodded, trying not to reveal anything. He left quickly, not wanting more questions. He knew the staff meant well, but he did not want them to interfere. His moments with Thomas felt personal and safe. At the park, Thomas greeted him with a small smile, though he looked tired again. Ethan noticed that Thomas coughed a few times. "Are you sure you're okay?" Ethan asked. Thomas tried to reassure him. "I'm fine," he said. "Just a slight cough. I'll be careful." Ethan nodded, but he still worried. He cared about Thomas's well-being and did not want to lose another important person in his life. Over the next few days, Ethan and Thomas talked more about their pasts. Ethan explained what he knew about his parents. He told Thomas how he remembered his mother's gentle voice and his father's laugh, and how hard it was to see those memories fade. Thomas listened quietly, nodding in understanding. Thomas also shared more about his wife, Margaret. He described their home. He talked about the small garden she kept. He mentioned how, after her death, friends stopped visiting as often. Some people offered help at first, but later they drifted away. Thomas did not blame them. People have their own lives. Still, it hurt to feel abandoned. One afternoon, Thomas arrived at the park holding an envelope. He looked unsettled. Ethan noticed right away. "Is something wrong?" he asked. Thomas sighed. "I got a letter from a nephew I rarely see," he said. "He heard that I've been spending time here with a boy. He asked if I'm doing all right and if I need help. He sounded concerned, or maybe suspicious." Ethan's heart sank a little. He knew people might not understand their friendship. "Are you going to stop meeting me?" he asked quietly. Thomas shook his head. "No," he said. "I just feel a bit annoyed that he assumes something is wrong because I'm talking to you. You've been good company for me. I don't want to give that up, because someone else doesn't understand." Ethan felt relieved. He had been worried that Thomas might decide it was not worth the trouble. "I'm glad," Ethan said. "I don't want to lose this time with you either." He was grateful that Thomas defended their connection. Back at the orphanage, Ethan noticed that some of the kids teased him more than usual. They said things like, daydreaming about some family that will never come. He ignored them, but it still hurt. At night, he drew the small garden Thomas had described. He tried to imagine Margaret tending the flowers while Thomas watched. He liked bringing their words to life in his notebook. The following afternoon, Ethan noticed that Thomas looked pale and coughed more frequently. Ethan decided to ask again, "Are you sure you're all right?" Thomas admitted he had a chronic lung condition, not life-threatening if managed, but it made him weak sometimes. Ethan felt afraid. "I don't want anything bad to happen to you," he said quietly. Thomas reached out and gently patted Ethan's hand. "I'm not going anywhere right now," he said. "I promise to take care of myself." Ethan accepted that answer, though he remained worried. As the day grew shorter, Ethan realized how much their daily talks mattered to him. He did not have anyone else who understood what it was like to carry sadness every day. Thomas might not live forever, but while he was here, he gave Ethan a sense of comfort that the boy had never found in the orphanage. They parted that evening, both feeling the weight of unspoken fears. Ethan headed back, hoping that tomorrow would bring another quiet afternoon at the park bench. The next day, Ethan arrived at the park and found Thomas already there, holding a small paper bag. When Ethan sat down, Thomas offered him a cookie. "I baked these this morning," he said. "I was thinking about Margaret and remembered one of her recipes." Ethan took a bite and smiled. The cookie was simple but tasty. "Thank you," he said. "It's nice to have something homemade." At the orphanage, homemade treats were rare. This felt like a small gift, something special. They talked about ordinary things for a while. Ethan mentioned how the orphanage staff seemed suspicious of his outings. Thomas nodded, understanding that Ethan had to be careful. Ethan explained that he just said he went to draw, and Thomas agreed that keeping their meeting simple might be best. After a few minutes, Ethan asked, "Have you ever thought about... do you ever wish you had children?" Thomas paused, thinking carefully before answering. "Yes," he said. "Margaret and I talked about it when we were younger, but it never happened. We had a good life anyway, but now, when I'm alone, I do wonder what it would have been like." Ethan felt a mixture of feelings. He wondered if someone like Thomas would ever consider giving a home to a boy like him. He knew it was a big thing to think about, and he tried not to let his mind wander too far. Still, the idea lingered quietly in his mind. The days passed and winter settled in. Ethan continued to visit, even when the air grew cold. He started wearing a heavier coat, and Thomas brought a thicker scarf. Their conversations grew deeper, but they never made promises they could not keep. They just enjoyed the time they had. One afternoon, as they were talking, Ethan noticed Thomas looked worried. "What's wrong?" Ethan asked. Thomas hesitated, then said, "I've been thinking about the future. I know you're in the orphanage, and you have no permanent family. I can't help but wish I could give you something more stable." Ethan's heart began to beat faster. He was not sure what Thomas was suggesting. He tried to remain calm. "What do you mean?" he asked. Thomas spoke slowly, choosing his words. "I've done some reading about adoption," he said. "It might be difficult because of my age and my health, but I want to explore the possibility. I don't want you to live your life believing no one wants you." Ethan's eyes widened. Nobody had ever said anything like that to him. He felt a wave of hope and fear mixed together. "Are you serious?" he asked, voice shaking. Thomas nodded. "I am. I know we have only known each other for a few months, but I feel like we understand each other. We both know what it's like to be alone, and I believe we could help each other heal." Ethan felt tears forming in his eyes. He looked down, not wanting to appear too hopeful in case it fell through. "I don't know what to say," he managed. "I want a family, but people always say nobody will adopt me. You're the first person who makes me think it might be possible." Thomas reached over and gently touched Ethan's shoulder. "I can't promise it will be easy," he said. "I have to talk to social workers, fill out papers, and pass whatever checks they require. But I want to try, if you're willing." Ethan nodded slowly. "I'm willing," he said quietly. "Thank you." They sat there for a while, both feeling the weight of this new direction. They discussed some of the practical steps Thomas might need to take. Ethan tried not to get too excited, but inside he felt a growing lightness. He thought about having a place he could call home, a person who cared enough to fight for him. As evening approached, Ethan realized he had to return to the orphanage. His heart was still racing with nervous energy. Before he left, Thomas said, "Let's not rush. I need to speak with the orphanage staff and figure out the process. But I will do my best." Ethan nodded, still stunned. He walked back quickly, trying to hide his feelings. Inside the orphanage, he sat quietly on his bed, his mind filled with questions. What if the orphanage staff did not trust Thomas? What if his health condition made it impossible? What if it took a long time and something went wrong? Despite all these worries, Ethan smiled to himself. Even if it did not work out, someone had thought he was worth adopting. Someone believed he deserved a home. That belief alone gave him a hope he had never felt before. Over the next few days, Ethan found it hard to concentrate at school. He kept imagining what it would be like to live with Thomas. He pictured a quiet house, maybe some framed photos on the walls, and no more thin soup every night. He imagined having his own space, where he could draw without worrying about someone teasing him. At the park, he and Thomas continued to plan. Thomas mentioned that he had contacted a social worker to ask about requirements. It would take time, he said, but he was ready to try. Ethan listened, his heart full of cautious optimism. Eventually, the afternoon light grew dim again. Ethan stood up to leave and looked at Thomas. "Thank you for thinking about this," he said softly. Thomas nodded. "You are worth the effort, Ethan," he replied. Ethan carried those words with him all the way back to the orphanage, feeling something he had not felt in a long time. Real hope for the future. Over the next few weeks, Ethan tried to be patient. He knew that adoption was a complicated process. He did not want to ask too many questions and put pressure on Thomas. Instead, he simply met Thomas at the park as usual, and they discussed small details each day. Thomas had contacted a social worker who agreed to meet with him. He explained to Ethan that he had to fill out forms, answer many questions, and prove that he could provide a stable home. Thomas admitted that he was nervous. He worried about his age and health, and he understood that social workers might have concerns. Ethan tried not to get too excited. He listened quietly when Thomas spoke about the steps involved. He wanted to believe it would happen, but he also knew that life often brought disappointments. Still, every time he walked to the park, he could not help feeling a hopeful flutter in his chest. One afternoon, Thomas arrived at the bench with a folder under his arm. He sat down and opened it, showing Ethan some of the documents he had collected. Ethan did not fully understand all the forms, but he saw Thomas's name, the orphanage's name, and official-looking stamps. "I've started the paperwork," Thomas said quietly. "I also spoke to someone at the orphanage today." Ethan's eyes widened. "You did?" he asked, surprised. Thomas nodded. "I did not mention you by name at first, but I asked what steps would be needed for a single older man to adopt a child. They were cautious, but they gave me some information. I will need to meet with a caseworker who handles your file." Ethan felt both nervous and excited. He wondered how the orphanage staff would react when they realized that Thomas wanted to adopt him. They might doubt that Thomas could handle the responsibility. They might discourage him, saying that an 11-year-old was too difficult to place or that Thomas's health was a risk. Ethan tried to prepare himself for bad news, but he hoped for the best. As the weather continued to cool, Ethan and Thomas discussed what a future home life might look like. They spoke in general terms, not wanting to get ahead of themselves. Thomas explained that he lived in a small house with 2 bedrooms. One bedroom had been his and Margaret's, and the other had mostly served as a guest room or storage space. He said he could fix it up for Ethan, maybe get him a proper desk to draw at. Ethan smiled at that idea. He pictured a desk with a lamp, a place where he could keep his pencils and paper. At the orphanage, he had no real privacy. The thought of having his own room felt almost too good to be true. A few days later, Thomas told Ethan that he had scheduled an appointment with the orphanage director and a social worker. "It will happen next week," Thomas said, looking both determined and nervous. "I will tell them about you, explain why I want to adopt you, and show that I understand what it means." Ethan nodded, his heart pounding. He knew he would probably not be present at that first meeting. He would have to wait at the orphanage and hope for good news. The suspense made him feel restless. At night he lay awake in bed, imagining the conversation. Would the director laugh at Thomas's request? Would the social worker say that an older man with health issues could not care for a growing boy? Or would they see that Thomas was kind, stable, and sincere? On the day of the meeting, Ethan went to school feeling distracted. He tried to focus on his lessons, but his mind drifted to the orphanage office. Thomas would be sitting there, explaining their connection. He would be talking about the afternoons at the park, the conversations, the trust they had built. Ethan hoped the staff would understand how important this was. After school, Ethan returned to the orphanage as usual. He had no idea what time Thomas's appointment was scheduled. He pretended to do his chores, but he kept looking at the clock, waiting for some sign. The staff acted normally around him, which gave him no clues. Just before dinner, a staff member told Ethan that the director wanted to see him in her office. Ethan's heart sank. He worried this might be a sign that the meeting had not gone well. He walked down the hallway and entered the director's office. She was seated behind a desk, and beside her stood Thomas, holding his hat in his hands. There was also a woman Ethan did not recognize, possibly the social worker. "Ethan," the director said, "Mr. Thomas here has expressed interest in adopting you." She paused, as if weighing her words. "We have had a good conversation with him, and we want to learn more about this situation. We know this is not a decision to be taken lightly." Ethan looked at Thomas, who gave him a small, reassuring nod. The social worker introduced herself and asked Ethan a few basic questions about how he knew Thomas. Ethan explained how they met in the park and how they talked almost every day. He told them that Thomas made him feel understood and that he enjoyed their conversations. He said he felt safer and happier since meeting Thomas. The adults listened carefully. The social worker wrote notes. The director asked Ethan how he would feel about living with Thomas. Ethan tried to be honest. "I know it might not be perfect," he said, "but I trust him. I think we could help each other." After a few more questions, the director said they would need some time to review Thomas's file and run background checks. Thomas understood. He thanked them for their time and left the office with Ethan. They stepped into the hallway, and Thomas said, "That went as well as I could have hoped. We will have to be patient, but I think they are not against the idea." Ethan nodded, relief washing over him. He knew it would take more than one meeting. There would be visits and evaluations, but at least the idea was on the table. Thomas had shown he was serious, and the orphanage staff seemed willing to consider it. "Thank you," Ethan said softly, looking up at Thomas. The man smiled and placed a gentle hand on Ethan's shoulder. "We're in this together," Thomas said. Ethan returned to his room that evening feeling lighter. He drew a picture of a small bedroom with a desk by the window. He did not label it as his room, but in his mind, he imagined it as part of Thomas's house. He kept the drawing tucked away, a private symbol of the future he dared to hope for. The next few weeks felt long, filled with waiting and uncertainty. Ethan continued his daily routine, waking early, going to school, helping out at the orphanage, and visiting the park in the afternoons when permitted. Thomas followed up with the social worker, filled out more forms, and answered more questions. Ethan noticed that some of the other children at the orphanage looked at him differently now. They had overheard rumors that someone might adopt him. Some were skeptical, saying it would never happen. Others seemed curious. Ethan tried not to talk about it too much. He did not want to jinx it. At the park, Thomas kept Ethan updated. "They asked for proof of my income and medical records," Thomas said one afternoon, looking tired. "I understand why. They need to be sure I can care for you." Ethan nodded. He appreciated Thomas's honesty, even though it made him anxious. He worried that the medical records might show something that would scare the social workers away. Still, Thomas never gave up. He appeared at the orphanage now and then for brief meetings, always calm and polite. He answered questions about his home, his daily life, and how he planned to meet Ethan's emotional and educational needs. The process was slow, but each step forward felt like a small victory. One morning, weeks later, Ethan was sitting in the orphanage common room, working quietly on a drawing, when he heard commotion at the entrance. He looked up and saw Thomas standing there, holding a folder of papers. The staff members gathered around, seeming surprised. Ethan stood up, heart pounding. He walked over to see what was happening. Thomas greeted him with a gentle smile. "I have some news," Thomas said. "I have completed all the necessary steps, and the social worker has approved my application. Now I have these adoption papers." He held up the folder so Ethan could see. Ethan felt tears well up in his eyes. He had never thought he would see this day. He glanced at the orphanage staff, who looked both surprised and impressed. The director approached and checked the papers, nodding as she flipped through the pages. "It seems everything is in order," she said, sounding slightly amazed. Ethan could hardly speak. He managed to say, "Really, is this really happening?" Thomas reached out and gently placed his hand on Ethan's arm. "Yes," he said. "I wanted to show you these to prove that nobody was lying. I want to give you a home, a family." The director cleared her throat and said, "Ethan, we will finalize the details in the coming days, but it looks like Mr. Thomas is well prepared. We will work out the transition period." Ethan nodded, still stunned. He had heard so many times that no one would want him. He had believed it on some level. Now he stood here, seeing solid proof that someone did want him. Thomas explained to the director and the social worker that he understood the responsibilities. He had set up the second bedroom and spoken with Ethan's school about the transfer of records. He had arranged for a checkup with his doctor to ensure he was stable enough for this responsibility. He had even stocked his pantry with food that he hoped Ethan would enjoy. Ethan listened quietly, feeling more grateful than he could express. Thomas had thought of everything. This was not a spontaneous gesture. It was a careful, deliberate act of kindness and commitment. Nobody had ever shown such determination on his behalf before. The orphanage staff set a date for the final approval. Ethan would continue living at the orphanage for a few more weeks, while all the paperwork was processed officially. After that, he would move into Thomas's house. Ethan did not mind waiting a bit longer. He knew it was a big decision, and he respected the rules. The important thing was that it was actually happening. When Thomas left that day, Ethan followed him outside for a moment. They stood near the entrance, and Ethan looked up at the older man. "I don't know how to thank you," Ethan said. His voice shook slightly. "I never thought anyone would do this for me." Thomas looked down at Ethan with kind eyes. "You don't need to thank me," he said. "We are going to help each other. I'm giving you a home, and you are giving me a reason to move forward. We both need this." Ethan nodded, understanding that they were both healing. Thomas had lost his wife and faced loneliness every day. Ethan had lost his parents and faced a system that did not encourage much hope. Together they had formed a bond that neither had expected. Back inside the orphanage, Ethan tried to remain calm, but he could not keep the smile off his face. Some of the other kids asked, "So it's true? You're getting adopted?" Ethan nodded and said, "It looks that way." They asked if he was scared. He admitted he was a little scared, but mostly excited. He knew life with Thomas would not be perfect. Thomas had health issues, and Ethan had scars from his past. But they understood each other, and that mattered. Later that night, Ethan took out his notebook and carefully drew a scene from memory. He and Thomas sitting on the park bench, both looking at the path ahead. He added small details: the worn scarf Thomas often wore, the lines in his face when he smiled, the shape of Ethan's backpack. He wanted to remember this part of their journey, when they were still between worlds, not yet living together, but no longer strangers. As he finished the drawing, Ethan felt a calm happiness. He had never dared to believe that someone would prove everyone else wrong. But Thomas had done it. He had shown that love and understanding could grow in unexpected places. Ethan would soon leave the orphanage and join Thomas in a home where he could have his own space, his own desk, and a person who cared if he was safe, warm, and happy. He went to sleep dreaming of that future, grateful for every step that had led him here. A few weeks passed before the final arrangements were complete. During that time, Ethan kept up with his routine. He went to school, did his chores at the orphanage, and visited Thomas when allowed. Both he and Thomas waited patiently as the paperwork moved through the system. Finally, the day arrived. The orphanage staff gathered Ethan's few personal items into a small bag. Ethan did not have much, just some clothes, his well-used notebook, and a couple of old pencils. The director gave Ethan a gentle farewell, reminding him that if he needed anything, he could always reach out. Some of the other children watched from a distance, curious and perhaps a bit envious, but no one said anything cruel this time. Thomas stood at the orphanage's entrance, looking a bit nervous but smiling warmly. Ethan approached him with careful steps. He knew this was a huge change, and he felt both excitement and worry. He had never lived anywhere else since losing his parents. But now, he was leaving with Thomas, a man who had chosen him despite everything. They walked home together. Thomas did not live far from the orphanage, but it still felt like entering a different world. When they reached the house, Ethan took in the surroundings. It was a small but tidy home on a quiet street. There were 2 bedrooms, a modest kitchen, a living room, and a small yard at the back. Thomas showed Ethan his new room. It was simple: a bed, a small desk, a lamp, and a window that let in soft light. There was a closet with space for clothes and a dresser with empty drawers. Ethan set his bag down and touched the desk. "I can draw here," he said quietly. Thomas nodded. "Yes, you can draw whenever you want," he said. "This is your space now. I hope you will feel comfortable here." That first evening felt strange. Ethan helped Thomas prepare a simple dinner, scrambled eggs and toast. Thomas admitted he was not a great cook, but he was willing to learn. They ate at a small table in the kitchen. It was quiet, but not uncomfortable. Ethan realized that, unlike the orphanage, he did not have to worry about mealtime ending too soon or someone teasing him. It was just him and Thomas. After dinner, they sat in the living room. Thomas offered Ethan a chance to watch some television or read a book. Ethan chose to look through an old bookshelf. He found a few novels and some magazines. Nothing fancy, but it was interesting to see what Thomas had collected. Thomas watched Ethan carefully, hoping he would feel at ease. Before bed, Thomas reminded Ethan that they had a routine to figure out. Ethan would continue going to school. Thomas would help him with homework if needed and attend any school meetings. They would work together to make sure Ethan had what he needed. Ethan nodded, feeling relieved. He understood that things would not be perfect right away, but Thomas cared enough to talk about these details. When Ethan went to his room that night, he sat at the desk and opened his notebook. He drew the simple outline of the small house. He included the window in his room, the kitchen table, and the hallway that connected everything. He wanted to capture this moment. This was his first night in a real home since he was 9 years old. The next day, Ethan woke up early. He wanted to help Thomas, as he had helped at the orphanage. Thomas was surprised to see him awake so soon. "You can sleep a bit longer," Thomas said, smiling. But Ethan said he was used to getting up early. He helped set the table for breakfast and made sure everything was neat. After breakfast, Ethan left for school. He felt different walking down the street. He knew that after school he had a home to return to. Not just a building where no one truly cared, but a place where Thomas would be waiting. He felt lighter, as if a burden had been lifted. At school, Ethan focused better than usual. He had always been quiet and respectful, but now he felt less anxious about the future. He talked to his teacher after class, mentioning that he had recently been adopted. The teacher congratulated him and asked if he needed any help adjusting. Ethan said he was fine for now, but he appreciated the kindness. When he returned home that afternoon, Thomas was there with a simple snack. Ethan noticed that Thomas looked a bit uncertain, as if worrying whether Ethan liked the snack or not. Ethan thanked him and ate quietly. It felt nice that someone cared about his comfort. They spent the rest of the day settling in. Thomas showed Ethan where extra blankets were stored, where to place dirty laundry, and how to lock the front door. These were ordinary things, but for Ethan, learning them felt special. It meant this was his life now, not just a temporary stop. Ethan understood that Thomas had his own struggles. Sometimes Thomas seemed tired or needed to rest after simple tasks. Ethan worried about that, but Thomas reassured him. "I will take care of myself," Thomas said. "You don't have to worry. We will manage." That evening, Ethan noticed a photo frame on a shelf in the living room. It showed Thomas and Margaret, both smiling. Ethan felt a bit sad for Thomas, knowing he had lost someone so important. He wondered if his presence reminded Thomas of what he no longer had. But when Thomas noticed Ethan looking at the photo, he said, "Margaret would be happy that I'm not alone now. She always said I had a kind heart." Ethan nodded. "I'm glad you chose me," he said softly. Thomas smiled gently. "I'm glad too," he replied. They ended the day feeling a bit closer, understanding that this was a new beginning for both of them. In the following days, Ethan and Thomas settled into a routine. Ethan attended school, did his homework at his desk, and helped with simple chores. Thomas managed his health by resting when needed and scheduling regular checkups. They learned each other's habits, likes, and dislikes. There were small challenges. Ethan felt nervous when he accidentally broke a glass one afternoon. He apologized repeatedly, worried that Thomas would be angry. Thomas simply cleaned up the pieces and said, "It's all right. Accidents happen." Ethan realized that this was different from the orphanage, where any mistake could bring scolding. Here, Thomas treated him with understanding. Thomas struggled at times, too. He had moments when he missed Margaret deeply. During such moments, he became quiet. Ethan gave him space, not wanting to intrude. Eventually, Thomas would talk about a memory or share a small story about Margaret, and Ethan would listen. It seemed that just having Ethan there made these moments easier. One evening, Ethan was exploring the house a bit and opened a closet in the hallway. Inside, he found a photo album. It contained pictures of Thomas and Margaret over the years. Some showed them in the park, others at family gatherings, and some during trips. Near the end of the album, there were empty pages. Ethan carried the album to the living room and asked Thomas about it. Thomas looked at the album and sighed. "Margaret and I never filled those last pages," he said. "We thought we had more time." He took a seat and flipped through a few of the photographs, smiling at some and looking sad at others. Ethan thought about how he could help. He remembered how drawing helped him capture memories. "What if we add new pages?" he asked. Thomas looked surprised. "What do you mean?" Ethan smiled softly. "We can't go back to the past," he said, "but we can add new memories, things we do together. I could draw them, print photos, or write notes." Thomas considered the idea. "I like that," he said. "It would mean the album is not just about the past, but also about the present." Ethan nodded. "Exactly. We don't have to forget Margaret or replace her. We can add to the story with what we have now." That evening, Ethan opened his notebook and chose a drawing to place in the album. He selected the one he had drawn of the two of them on the park bench. He carefully tore out the page and trimmed it neatly. Thomas brought some tape, and they stuck the drawing onto a blank page. Underneath, Ethan wrote the date and a short note. "Our first conversation." They looked at the new page together. Thomas smiled, his eyes misty. "This is a good beginning," he said. Ethan agreed. They decided to add more entries as time passed. Maybe Ethan would draw their new home, the small yard, or a meal they shared. They could also take a simple photograph and print it somewhere to include in the album. As the days went by, Ethan found that he no longer worried about being wanted. He knew Thomas wanted him, not out of pity, but because they shared something valuable. They both understood loss and needed someone who cared. The orphanage's predictions, the rude comments from other children, all of that seemed far away now. At school, Ethan found it easier to participate. He asked a few more questions in class, feeling that he had a stable foundation at home. His teacher noticed a positive change and praised Ethan for his focus and determination. Ethan smiled, thinking about telling Thomas about it when he got home. At home, Thomas tried cooking something new, a simple pasta dish. It was not perfect, but it was decent enough, and Ethan appreciated the effort. After dinner, they talked about small things, how Ethan's day went, whether Thomas felt any pain, and what they might do on the weekend. Thomas suggested going back to the park for a walk, just to enjoy the fresh air. That weekend, they did visit the park. They sat on the same bench where they had first met. It felt different now that Ethan lived with Thomas. They no longer felt like two strangers who happened to share a quiet moment. They felt like family. Ethan brought his notebook and made a quick sketch of them sitting together. He planned to place it in the album later. Thomas looked at the path, remembering Margaret, but also feeling thankful for Ethan's presence. He realized that he had not just adopted a child, he had found a new purpose and a chance to heal. As they headed home, Ethan said, "I used to think that I was not good enough for anyone, but you proved me wrong." Thomas placed a hand on Ethan's shoulder. "You were always good enough," he said. "I am glad I saw it." Back at the house, Ethan organized his drawings and picked one of the new sketches to add to the album. He wrote a small note. "Our first visit to the park as a family." Thomas read the note and nodded. "We are a family now," he said. Ethan smiled, knowing those words were true. In the days that followed, their life continued with small routines and quiet understanding. They knew they could not erase the past, but they could shape their future together. Ethan felt safe, and Thomas felt less alone. The empty pages of the album were waiting to be filled, not to replace old memories, but to stand beside them. Ethan went to sleep one night, thinking about how different his life was now. He had a home, a person who cared, and a reason to believe in tomorrow. He realized that love could appear in unexpected ways. For both Ethan and Thomas, their journey proved that loss did not mean life had to remain empty. They had found each other, and that made all the difference.